So here we go. This is the big scandal of the week that everybody was talking about. There was an article in Harper's magazine, which is, like a left-wing publication, and it's titled "A Letter on Justice and Open Debate." And so this was about cancel culture, and I want to read you some key parts, and I'm going to tell you who signed it and why this was so controversial. So here's, the gist of it summed up. They say, editors are fired for running controversial pieces, books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity, journalists are barred from writing on certain topics, professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class, a researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. So, the things that they allude to in there are real cases. I think the most egregious example was that there was this guy, this professor, who, in the wake of the riots in Minneapolis and elsewhere, he shared a study. And it's actually a study we covered on this show as well. And the study found that it actually is the case that nonviolent peaceful resistance wins a hell of a lot more than riots. And, the argument is, and it was a researcher who studied the civil rights movement professionally and did it for years. And they found that what happens when you have peaceful, nonviolent resistance is that attracts very positive media coverage. And when you have the positive media coverage, that sort of sways the wishy-washy centrists in the country and makes people become supportive of the agenda of the people who are acting very peacefully. And actually, funny enough, if the cops are being violent against the peaceful protesters, that helps the peaceful protesters even more. That's when you really get change, is when people see almost like a comic book villain-like situation where the cops are being clearly wrong and the peaceful protesters are clearly right. That's the thing that leads to change the most. What doesn't lead to change is when you have, violent protests or riots, because then what happens is the media turns on the protests and they start describing, a situation as dangerous, and then the wishy-washy centrists turn towards believing more in law and order and security and hey, get things under control if they see violent protests and riots. So this guy shared this study, and then there was a backlash, and he was fired over it. And he was fired because, he wasn't sufficiently supportive enough of Black Lives Matter, and this is undermining the important movements, and it was a terrible rationalization, and it was honestly abysmal and comical, but that's exactly what happened. The person was fired for sharing a study about how nonviolent peaceful resistance is preferable to riots. Think about how insane that is. And there's many instances of this. Li Fang was interviewing people about the riots, and there was somebody we was speaking to who was a minority, and the person said, I agree, police brutality is horrible and we have to stop it, and I side with the movement on this front. I just also wish that there was more concern about the run-of-the-mill crime that's happening in our communities. Now, listen, that is an old conservative trope, but what about the black-on-black crime? That's definitely an old conservative trope, and when a conservative uses it, as a general rule, they're just deflecting from police injustices. So they're almost like, hey, there's nothing to see there. There's no problem to fix there. What about the black-on-black crime? It's a way to deflect. So I do think that's a Weasley argument. But context matters. And this young minority who's pro-Black Lives Matter who was saying this, that context is different than a hardcore conservative using it to deflect. I think that person's actually concerned about the crime rate in his community, and so he's making a point. Li Fang tweeted it out. He was immediately accused of being a hardcore racist, and he was forced to do this apology over it. So anyway, I'm dragging on here, but the point of the article is very simple. The point of the article is hey guys, can we please just not fire people or totally socially ostracize them for having questionable or fringe opinions. You could disagree with them, you could argue over stuff, but please just don't be overly punitive. Like do an outrage mob where somebody's life is ruined, dox them or whatever, or fire them, which has been happening a lot when people say things that are just ever so slightly off base. Let's not do that anymore, please. Like that's the gist of the letter, okay? Now, I totally agree with that sentiment, but let's dive into this a little deeper. So here are some of the people who signed this. This is interesting. Obviously, you could see J.K. Rowling, however you say it, Noam Chomsky, but also David Brooks, David Frum, Malcolm Gladwell, Fareed Zakaria of CNN, Matt Iglesias of Vox, Barry Weiss, Zephyr Teachout, Bernie Surrogate, she's great, Solomon Rushdie, and Wynton Marsalis. I thought that one was interesting. He seems like, musician amongst people who are more, newsy. But anyway, I digress. That's just some of the people who signed it. I believe there's like maybe about 100 people who signed it. So there was a giant backlash over this. Now, what exactly is the nature of the backlash? Well, I think the first point people made, and on this one I kind of agree, if you read the article, it does kind of sound like really self-important and self-aggrandizing in a way where these people think like, yes, we are the last bastions of freedom of speech, good sir. And it's just like, okay, relax a little bit. Like, also scale is important in this conversation. And I wouldn't put cancel culture on the list of like top 5 or 10 most pressing issues in the country. I mean, for Christ's sake, there's a pandemic where over 120,000 people have been killed and rising rapidly. There's effectively a new depression which is going on, over 20% real unemployment. We have a healthcare crisis where we had 28 million people without insurance. Now it's another at least 20 million on top of it that don't have health insurance. We have an eviction and foreclosure crisis, which is just getting started. We're covering a story later on this preposterously high percentage of people in New York City who haven't paid their rent since March. So, like, there's so many real issues that override this. The wars are way more important than this that are still going on. There's so much more going on. And, like, you get the sense that so many people who sign this letter, with some exceptions, like this guy here, they don't have a sense of the scale. They really think that, like, the worst thing in the world is that people are mean to them in their Twitter mentions. And so, therefore, this piece comes across as insufferably smug for that reason. Listen, that critique I kind of agree with. I kind of agree with that. Now, the other point that people make, which is absolutely true, is there are a lot of people who sign this letter who are just utterly disgusting, total and complete hypocrites who don't even abide by the principles that they're pretending to abide by. So the best example of this is Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss very famously tried to get a professor, or may have been professors, plural, fired because they were pro-Palestine. And she's the first one. Like, there's a lot of these people who pretend to care about free speech, like Ben Shapiro, Barry Weiss, who the second anybody criticizes Israel, even mildly, all of a sudden it's anti-Semite, 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 oh my God. Again, she literally tried to get somebody fired over their take on Israel-Palestine. So, the point that, listen, a lot of people in this letter simply don't agree. They're pro-cancel culture when they're against the people espousing a political opinion. I think that's so true. It's so true. These people are terrible hypocrites. I mean, another great example of this is, and another problem with the letter is that oftentimes when you talk about free speech, the dialogue of free speech, it's deployed by pampered elites or right-wing idiots to deflect any and all reasonable criticism. So the best example of this one is Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin has never heard a critique of him that he thought wasn't a smear. Anything anybody's ever said against him is a smear. And when somebody disagrees with him, all that is evidence that somebody's intolerant of other ideas. So it's like, it's a way to try to take any criticism and say, that's out of bounds. and I won't even respond to it because it's not even a sincere criticism. Everybody's a nefarious actor, and any disagreement with me is just cancel culture. And so I've seen that so many times, and I think that a lot of people on the left, their only experience with, free speech dialogue is like right-wingers and pampered elites screaming about it when it doesn't even really apply. They're just being mildly critiqued. Like J.K. Rowling's another example. She'll say something on trans issues. A bunch of people will say, hey, I disagree with that and I think it's transphobic. And she's like, oh my God, I've been canceled, good sir. It's like, hey, relax. People disagree with you. You might massively disagree with their characterization of you as transphobic, but they have the right to call you transphobic if they think you're transphobic. That also is freedom of speech. So it's like, in my mind, so when you talk about cancel culture, what's real cancel culture? I mean, the first thing on the list I would say is like Trump wanting to throw people in jail for a year for burning the American flag. That's cancel culture. That is literally against the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and against free speech. Literally. Another example of cancel culture, in North Carolina, in a town in North Carolina, they banned protests. How did they do it? If you showed up, they arrested you to protest at a Confederate monument. They arrested you if you showed up, and then if you went to try to get a permit to go protest, they would deny you permits. So effectively banning free protest and free speech. That is real cancel culture. What else is cancel culture? What I just described before. If there are professional consequences for something that you say which is out of the mainstream. So, again, like somebody being fired for having an opinion that's out of the mainstream. I think that's cancel culture. A lot of these people are just mad that their Twitter mentions are full of people disagreeing with them. Seriously. And they think this is cancel culture. No, it's not. Sometimes people say stupid shit, and then other people pounce on their stupid shit. It happens. But they really think that like having mean Twitter mentions is the worst thing in the world. So I think that that's also a reasonable criticism of this article. It's really pompous and arrogant sounding and self-aggrandizing, which is gross. A lot of the people who signed on to it are total hypocrites. And oftentimes free speech is deployed just as like a total shield and diversionary tactic to not discuss the substance of what somebody's saying and not address the disagreement, and just to say all criticism is just cancel culture, and so I'm right and I'm not even going to engage. So it's almost, and funny enough, it's a way to shut down free speech and a free exchange of ideas. We've seen that too. So I think all those criticisms are true. But overall, listen, even though the article reads in a pompous way, there's a reason why Noam Chomsky signed it. There's a reason why Zephyr Teachout signed it. There's a reason why, a bunch of people who I think are totally sincere signed it. Because the gist that they got out of it, which is undeniably true, the core of it is, hey, please don't fire people or totally socially ostracize them for having questionable or fringe opinions. That's it. So even though I actually totally agree with many of the criticisms of this, I think the people who criticize it without acknowledging the obvious point that free speech is massively important, I think they're totally missing the mark, and they've actually become sort of like a parody of themselves. There's this caricature of the left as like, they're just censorious little petty authoritarians who go after anybody who disagrees with them and are in favor of professional consequences for people who disagree with them. And like, if you're criticizing this without adding the addendum, the caveat, the little asterisks and saying, hey man, having said all that, free speech is massively important, then you're kind of a sucker. And eventually, the chickens are going to come home to roost. And at some point, you will realize how important freedom of speech is. Why do I say that? Because, listen, when it comes to cancel culture, the primary victims, this is something that's going to blow a lot of people's minds, the primary victims are the left. It's always been the left. Noam Chomsky has been canceled more times in his life than any of us can frickin' count. You want to know why? Because Noam Chomsky tours the United States of America giving speeches calling the United States of America the #1 terror state in the world. You don't think that's controversial to many people? It absolutely is controversial to many people. You know what else has been happening on social media? Facebook pulled down a page called Cop Watch because they exposed the cops doing terrible things. No, I look at that and say, that's freedom of speech, and that's holding the cops accountable. Well, turns out power centers are pro-cop, and so they say, no, this is more like hate speech. and we got to take it down. You're being too critical of cops. Pro-Palestinian Facebook pages have been pulled down under the guise of this is hate speech, and they're massively anti-Semitic. Pro-BDS pages. There was an anti-war journalism outlet that was pulled down from Facebook. And they came up with some bullshit, dubious thing like, oh, the funding was questionable or something, so they pulled it down. Guys, the left will always be the primary target of censorship. Why? Because the left actually threatens power centers. If you threaten power centers, they will first come for you. Look at Edward Snowden. Look at Julian Assange. Look at Chelsea Manning. If you want, especially when it comes to social media, the last thing you should want is to give powers of censorship and filtering and deplatforming to Silicon Valley billionaires. They don't agree with you. They don't agree with you. So I don't know how clear I could say it. If you gave censorship powers to social media, and we had social media in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War, they would have pulled down everybody who was saying, actually wrong, Saddam doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam did not work with Al-Qaeda. They would have said, that's fake news, we can't allow that in the discourse, pull it down. They would have pulled us down, and they actually did try to drown us out in 2016 when we said, oh my God, the WikiLeaks proved that Bernie Sanders was screwed in the primary and Hillary stole it. Mainstream media was like, no, that's fake news. And if you discuss it, you're a Russian puppet and you're doing the bidding of a hostile foreign power. They look at us and say, we're fake news, and mainstream media has it nailed. Russiagate! If you dissent on Russiagate, you're viewed as wrong in the eyes of polite society. Why the hell would you want to give people who are part of the establishment more powers to censor? So just I don't know what to tell you if you don't realize how important free speech is. See, the problem is many people get too comfortable and they think, well, obviously it'll never affect me because my opinions are all correct. And bro, people don't agree with you. People don't agree with us. A lot of the things that the left say is super counterculture and edgy in polite society. They definitely will come after hardcore Black Lives Matter people. They definitely will come after Marxists. I mean, this, again, I'm amazed that some people don't see this. It's obvious. So you have to realize why free speech is so important. And this is why somebody like Noam Chomsky signed this, because despite all the arrogance of the letter and the hypocrites who are on it, the core of it is, let's stop cancel culture. And I think that absolutely needs to happen. And why would you cede this ground to the right also? Why would you do that? Because now you're making them look more edgy than you. And you look like you're, the person with a stick up your ass, mods, please come help. You're making them look cooler than they are. The real way you respond to the right is how I'm responding to them now, where you say, well, actually, you're a hypocrite. You don't believe in free speech. And I do believe in free speech. How you like them apples? That's how you do it. And listen, just final thing. It's hard to reconcile all the names on this letter because, listen, some of those people, like David Frum, for example, the reason why he's signing on to this is because people on social media who are correct are saying, hey, you're a war criminal and nobody should take you seriously and you should be shunned in polite society. I think the critics in that case are correct. I think that there should be a healthy taboo on war crimes. To the extent that there are any moral lines and that cancel culture is important, I would say that being a war criminal is clearly on one side of that line. So, the reason he signed this is totally cynical. Because again, we know that the second David Frum would use cancel culture against his political enemies, who are usually correct, by the way, his political enemies, like that. So he's not actually anti-cancel culture. He is a hypocrite. And the reason why David Frum and a guy like David Frum is signing on to this because he's a war criminal and he's felt repercussions of that, at least in the social sphere. A guy like David Brooks is against it because he writes a dumb article every month and then everybody laughs at him and makes fun of him. I think the reason why this segment is so long is because I'm trying to give all the nuance and all the perspective in it that a lot of the people are hypocrites. A lot of times free speech dialogue is just a shield and it's a deflection. And like a lot of these people are total clowns who just mean like, hey, don't cancel me. Like that's all they mean. But at the same time, even though the letter sounds kind of pompous, the core of it, I think, is undeniably true, which is why somebody like Noam Chomsky and somebody like Zephyr Teachout signed on to it. So we have to be willing to acknowledge that it's a complex world we live in, and that's the nature of reality with this letter. That you shouldn't disagree with the letter as such. You can critique it, but also acknowledge that, yes, cancel culture is a real problem. I think that's what gets so frustrating about this, is that like there is a healthy contingent now on the left that just pretends like cancel culture isn't a real thing. What about all these examples I gave where it is unhealthy? And you are, if anything, you're actually hurting your side, because the way that you convince people is, yes, by using persuasion, by using arguments, by almost taking little points of agreement and then exacerbating it, and then like finding other areas where you can convince people. This is why, my show, not to toot my own horn here, but the thing that I love the most that I hear whenever I go to these events like Politicon, people come up to me and say, hey man, you saved me from the alt-right pipeline. And I love hearing that, because then that's exactly the point. The point is I'm trying to craft arguments on this show that it's not just me preaching to the choir. It's me expanding beyond my bubble and almost getting people who otherwise would dislike me on a lot of stuff to say, I agree with Kyle on that. Interesting. Now let me see what he has to say on this other thing. So like that's how you convince people. You don't do it through like firing them or doxing them or any of these terrible things if they happen to have an opinion that's gross. So, I forgot where I was going with that train of thought, but that there are people who really do pretend like cancel culture isn't a thing. And it's like, you're just being ridiculous at that point. You're just being totally ridiculous, and it's kind of silly. And I've seen different variations. There are people who say cancel culture just doesn't exist. And then there are people who say, well, it exists and is totally good, and I've never seen an example of it like that wasn't justified. And I think both of those are it's just such sloppy thinking. And it's gross. And yeah, I don't know what else to say about this other than I get a lot of the criticisms, but overall, for the love of God, the left needs to embrace the mantle of free speech because it's vitally important.